the organizer of EdTech Malmö. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Wedman, all the way from Umeå up north in Sweden. Jonathan is a researcher in the field of educational measurement, a distinguished university teacher specialized in assessment in education. He's currently employed as an assistant professor at the Department of Applied Educational Science at University, and has also authored an excellent book, I must say, called Prov, or Test in English, I think. Please welcome Jonathan Wedman.
Okay, thank you all of you, and thank you for that introduction. So, I'm Jonathan, and I'm here today to talk about test and test construction, and with a particular focus on multiple choice questions, or MCQs. So the idea is today to try to create a sort of a discussion, or at least an interactive presentation. So feel free at any time to interrupt me with questions if you have any. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start to share my screen and just share a fairly brief PowerPoint, about 20-25 minutes long, that I've prepared, that sort of addresses different aspects of testing. Now, I don't, there's not a demand from my point of view that I get to finish the presentation, because again, I'm not the one that's actually in focus. You are. Your questions and the actual field or the topic of multiple choice questions is the focus of today's presentation. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. So I'm sharing my screen in 3, 2, 1. Now you should be able to see my PowerPoint presentation. So let's see how far along I get with this until one or more of you want to interrupt me with questions or comments. So first of all, a disclosure statement. I am not an objective party in this matter, because I love tests and have done so for the past about 16 years. Ever since I first took a course called Test and Test Construction, I realized that this is what I want to do with my life and nothing else. And then I became a psychometrician. And like Frederick said, I got my PhD in educational measurement with a focus on large scale assessment, so such as the SWISAT or högskoleprovet. But when you have tests in an educational setting, so why do we have them? Let's just start by clarifying this. We have tests in an educational or a non-educational setting because we want to measure student or test taker achievement in a classroom context to gather as much reliable and valid information as possible about progression in relation to the expected learning outcomes in as little time as possible. So you have a lot of information, you have a quality of information, and you have time or briefness. So why even care about time? Shouldn't we only focus on quality? And yeah, quality is the main factor, but you cannot disregard time as a sort of frame or a limiting aspect of testing. So you have these three things. You have quantity, quality, and time. And if any one of you recognizes this triangle, it's because I stole it from the movie The Big Short. But in that movie, it was used in a different context. So I adapted their triangle to fit this assessment context, and it does. So these three parts, quality, quantity, and time, this is all nice and good. However, you can only choose two of these. You can either construct a lot of questions that have very high quality, but it's going to take you a lot of time. So this is time or speediness. Or you can construct a lot of questions in a very short amount of time, but you won't have a decent quality of those questions. Or you can construct high quality items in a very short amount of time, but you won't have a lot of them. So time is always a factor. So I guess what you should aim for when constructing any test, including the assessment part of it, is to have a reasonable amount of quantity, a reasonable amount of quality in a reasonable amount of time. So before I move on to some of the actual thoughts or ideas about test construction, I want to reminisce on what a big researcher in psychometrics said all the way back in 1982, so 40 years ago. He stated the following: tests composed mainly of selected response and short answer items will most likely encourage students to remember, interpret, and analyze the ideas of others. And tests composed mainly of essay items will most likely encourage students to organize, integrate, and express their own ideas. And it is also apparent that these two types tend to complement each other. And this is something I want to bring about because a testing format, an item format such as the multiple choice question or MCQ, it's sort of like rock, paper, scissors. It's good for a particular purpose, but it's not the type of question that beats everything, because it has its strength and its weaknesses. But of course, its strength is to encourage students to remember, interpret, and analyze the ideas of others. And just by looking at this, you can see that obviously this is important. Yes, we want students to be able to organize, integrate, and express their own ideas, but not only to do that, because we want them to actually learn something, take part of the knowledge field that has been created before them. So multiple choice questions, they are a large part of learning or assessing learning, and they are a relevant part of learning. It's just a matter of when to use them and how to use them for them to be as effective as possible. So what I'm going to start talking about multiple choice questions, and in particular some of the guidelines that govern multiple choice questions and short questions as well. Now, the guidelines, some of which I've got here, comes from a marvelous scientific article called A Review of Multiple Choice Item Writing Guidelines for Classroom Assessment. This article, or sort of a meta-analysis or literature review, whatever you want to call it, was written about 20 years ago, and I am fairly confident that more or less every paper that has been published since then that has to do with constructing multiple choice questions has in one way, shape, or form based their text, their guidelines on this article. So if you ever come across this, please read it because it is excellent. They outline 31 guidelines for test construction, both when it comes to the actual items and when it comes to the options that are always present in the multiple choice questions. So I'm obviously I don't have time to go through 31 guidelines, and you're probably not interested in hearing me talk about all of those guidelines. So I figured I could mention a few words about some of the core guidelines, or some of the main ones that are good to keep in mind. So first of all, important content. This is the first guideline, and it's the first one for a reason. You should base each item on important content to learn and avoid trivial content. Now, this might sound obvious, but in a test constructing situation, it's fairly easy when you're struggling to create a really good question, and you're stressed for time, because time is always a factor, sometimes you tend to just want to ask something that's easy to ask for. So let's take this for an example. I teach a lot. I teach about assessment theory or test theory as well. So one of the things I want my students to know about is reliability. So I give them this question: how many vowels are present in the term inter-rater reliability? Now, this was very easy for me to construct. And it's also good because I can vary this in several ways. Because inter-rater reliability is not the only important term that has to do with quality of testing. You have about 40, or you can say 50 terms that are important for students to know in test construction. So this means that I have 50 variations of this item. I can ask about internal consistency. I can ask about content evidence. I can ask about so many different terms. So all of a sudden, I have 50 items. Now, I don't only have to ask about vowels. I can ask about consonants too. How many consonants are present in the term inter-rater reliability, and all of those other terms. And then I have 50 more items. So now I have 100 items. And I can also reverse the question. So I can ask how many of the alphabet's vowels are not present in the term inter-rater reliability, and all of a sudden I have 100 questions more. So I have 200 questions, and all of them are completely worthless, because this is not what reliability, or what I want my students to know about reliability, is about. It's not about the vowels. Now, a better question could be something like this: in which situations is inter-rater reliability more appropriate to use than internal consistency? Now, this is a question I really want students to know, or test takers and test users in general, but I don't have 200 variations of this. So this is what I should use, and personally, of course, this is what I would use. But it's very easy to slip into the frame of thought that this brings. A question that's easy to create and that's easy to vary, so we'll just ask for it. There is a saying, and I don't know who actually coined this saying, but it goes like this: if you are unable to measure what's important, then you tend to decide that what you can measure is important. And this is what we want to get away from. So always focus on the content. Whatever it is you want to do, make sure you're actually measuring something relevant. Now, the second thing that's good to keep in mind when you construct multiple choice questions is what sort of cognitive processes or cognitive levels you're after. Sometimes you want to measure knowledge and understanding, if we're referring to Bloom's revised taxonomy here. But sometimes you want to measure some process, some more complex process, or some higher cognitive level, such as application, analysis, or maybe even judgment. So in order to get to these higher levels, this guideline comes to mind: to use novel material. So the guideline is technically: use novel material to test higher level learning. Paraphrase textbook's language or language used during instruction when used in a test item to avoid testing for simply recall. So what is it? What does this mean? Well, let's give you an example. Let's say I ask my students this: why should simple vocabulary be used when writing multiple choice test items? So here I'm looking for sort of an analysis. I'm looking for whether my students can analyze a cause and effect relationship, and if they can make a judgment about what's preferable over not being preferable in testing. So I'm after analysis and judgment, so higher order thinking skills. And my student gives this answer. Well, Jonathan, because simplified language is an effective way to reduce the influence of reading ability, a source of construct irrelevant variance when the achievement test is intended to measure something else. Now, wait a minute. Now, this is an excellent question, excellent answer. So here my student has clearly demonstrated the ability to analyze and judge the course content material. If it wasn't for the fact that it was stolen straight out of that article I mentioned earlier on writing classroom guidelines. It says right here, simplified language is an effective way to reduce, and so on. So what did I actually measure with this? Did I measure my students' ability to analyze and interpret and judge the course content? No. No, I didn't. I measured their ability at best to remember what was written in the course literature, or at worst, I just measured their ability to copy-paste from the course literature. Now, in a multiple choice question, of course, you have already written the distractors, but the principle is the same. If the correct answer on a multiple choice question is something that is verbatim from either the course literature or a lecture or something that has been discussed during training, then you are not measuring a higher order thinking skill. You're measuring the student's ability to remember the course content. Now, remembering course content is relevant also. For example, when it comes to rules or security measures, what are you allowed to do in this situation to avoid killing yourself or killing other people? That's a good rule to remember. So it's a lower level thinking skill, but it's extremely important. So I'm not saying that you should never measure lower level thinking skills, remember and understand. What I'm saying here is that sometimes when you want to measure higher order thinking skills, you really have to try to construct the question so to actually get at these higher levels. For some reason, this is already present. The next guideline has to do with trick items, because sometimes I meet and talk to teachers who say that they like to use trick items because they really measure the content that you want to measure, except for the fact that they don't. Trick items measure the student's ability to see through what you're trying to trick them into believing. Now, unless seeing through the teacher's trickery is part of an expected learning outcome or course content, you should not measure it. Don't use trick items, because students or test takers who actually have the required knowledge but are unable to see through the trickery, they will still get the answer incorrect. So they have the knowledge that you want them to have, and they would have been able to demonstrate this knowledge if you had just phrased the question correctly. So trick items has no educational value and no psychometrical value as well, so just avoid them. I'm not going to read this entire example. If you're watching this on YouTube sometime in the future, you can just pause and read it for yourselves. But what this question is about is that the first half of the question is about evidence based on test content. But then the actual question is about evidence based on relations to other variables. So in this case, a student will be thinking about test content, these first 3.5 lines of text, and then the question is about something else. So this is not very nice, especially if you have a student that is stressed, stressed for time perhaps, or just nervous, they might not be able to see through this trick. They will read half of the question, they will realize that this is about evidence based on test content, and they will answer this, which is incorrect in this case. So be nice to your students. Be open and transparent about what you are measuring. This is a small one. Grammar and spelling. Use correct grammar, punctuation, capitalization, and spelling, because it's really annoying when you don't. And sometimes some misspellings can heavily alter the meaning of the question or the word, or can just be very, very strange. And this one, avoid window dressing, more formally known as excessive verbiage. I'm going to read this because I want to make a point. Once upon a time, there were two boys who really liked the idea of becoming psychometricians when they grew up. One of the boys was named Charlie, after the famous book by British author Roald Dahl. I have forgotten the name of the other boy. Let's call him John, or Johan, or something that begins with J. Let's call him J. One of the boys had 5 Swedish crowns, and the other one had twice as much money. They wanted to use their money to buy a candy bar for 14 Swedish crowns. Could they afford it? Motivate your answer. If this was an open-ended question, it would end here if it was a multiple choice question. So why did I read this? Because it took time. When you have multiple choice questions, you often have a lot of questions, because that's one of the selling points of multiple choice questions. So you don't want to have your test takers having to read a whole bunch of nonsense during the testing time. Your test takers should be able to focus on 2 things: remembering and understanding the course content, and actually being able to express their the course content. They should not be able to have to read a whole bunch of text that have nothing to do with what's being measured. So all of this can just as simply be shortened down to this: 2 friends that are at a store. One of the friends has 5 crowns, the other has twice as much. Can they afford a candy bar that costs 14 crowns? You're able to gather the same information about student or test taker achievement with this question, but they will have more time and more energy to focus their ability to demonstrate their achievement on other questions of the test as well. So avoid window dressing. And I believe this is my last one that I wanted to show you. Word the stem positively. That is the question when you're constructing multiple choice questions. Try to avoid words such as not and except. And if negative words are used, use them cautiously, and always ensure that the word appears capitalized and boldface. Because when a question looks like this, it's fairly easy to miss out on this word, especially if you have reading difficulties or dyslexia, or if you're just, again, pressed for time. And if you miss on the negative the negative word, then you're going to completely misunderstand the question and answer something else. If you have to use a negative, then make sure it's in capital letters and boldface so no one can miss it. But on the other hand, when you use a question that's formulated in a negative fashion, what information are you actually getting? Well, you might want to think that you are getting information about what the students know based on what they don't know, but in fact you're not. You're only getting information that the students know what the incorrect answer is. You don't actually know if they know the correct answer. So you have information that the students know that something is incorrect. So it's not a good question from a knowledge perspective. Again, this might be cause for you might want to use this sometimes when it has to do with guidelines or dangers. What is not allowed? What is not a safe method? On the other hand, most questions that have a negative can be worded positively. What is an appropriate response? What is allowed to do? What is a safe measure to take? And my 2 cents in all of this: avoid showing personal frustration in test items. If this is your question, researchers are not just a bunch of glorified paper pushers. Name 2 benefits for mankind that research has contributed to. If you read this question, you're going to get the opinion or idea that whoever wrote it was in a really bad mood. Because it sounds like they were really frustrated about being called a glorified paper pusher. So just try to formulate your answer in your question in a neutral fashion. Name 2 benefits for mankind that research has contributed to. You get the same information from your test takers, but without showing your emotions in the matter. So that was what I wanted to show you on this presentation. I could have talked for 2 hours more about this topic because it's really fun. But if any one of you have any questions right now, I would be happy to hear them.
Thank you, Jonathan, for an interesting presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Very interesting. We have tested multiple choice from time to time in our university here in Malmö. And for me, it feels a bit like that students don't really like it. They are quite unwilling to accept it because they would rather write essays. What kind of answer would you give a student who is unhappy with multiple choice?
I didn't hear the last part. I heard you until you said that students want to write essays.
Yes, so we sometimes get like complaints about that they think it's unfair and so on. What would you answer a student who is saying, I'm not in favor of multiple choice, I would rather write essays?
Not in favor of multiple choice, rather write
Yeah.
essays.
Yeah, good question. So this brings us back to the whole rock, paper, scissors thing. Yeah, some students won't like multiple choice questions because some students are really good. I'm guessing that it's the students that are really good at formulating themselves in an essay situation that want the essay questions. But you have some, all assessment methods have an inherent bias to it. So essay questions, yeah, it's good if you're good at formulating yourself in writing. On the other hand, if you have a very good grasp of the test content and you're not good at communicating this through writing, the essay test is not really a fair test to use. In the same way, you have seminars or oral testing. Yeah, some people, they are fairly poor at writing, or at least they're unsure of it, but they're good at expressing themselves verbally, so they're going to want the oral test. On the other hand, other people are shy, or maybe they have a speech impediment, or they're just not comfortable in speaking in front of others, so they would be better at writing things down on a piece of paper. So my point is that the most fair thing you can do as a teacher is to try to have a varied set of exams. So you have the multiple choice questions when you want to, especially when you want to measure the student's ability to remember and understand something to some degree, whether they want to, they can apply or analyze data. And then you have some other part of the course. Maybe you have some goal or expected learning outcome that says that students should be able to reason or discuss about something. Yeah, it's really hard to measure reasoning skills and the ability to discuss things with multiple choice questions. You could possibly do it, but it's fairly difficult. So for that, you can use these seminars and you can use the essay question. And then you might have part of your course that has to do with students being able to display an ability or a skill, the ability to do something. Then you want some sort of practical test. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question, but my sort of answer to this is that, yeah, it doesn't matter what assessment method you use. Some student will always think that it's unfair or they won't like it. And it's just a matter of saying to the students that, well, you know, each method is unfair to someone. I'm trying to vary because that makes it the grade all in all the most fair one. Was that a fair answer to your question, or did you have a follow-up?
Excellent, I think. Another question I'm having is, we now talked about how to formulate the questions. Is there an idea how many answers there should be to a question? How many alternatives should there be?
Yes. Yes, there is. I'm really glad you asked that question because that's something that raised a lot. So I'm actually going to sort of give you, without a visual aid, just a quick example. If I were to ask you, what is the capital in the US state, what is the capital city of the US state of Texas? And let's say I give you 3 alternatives: Austin, Dallas, Houston. You have a question and you have 3 alternatives. How about I don't give you just 3? I add Stockholm, Umeå, Malmö, and Gothenburg. See, now I have 7 alternatives or options. And we've all heard at some point that more options are better. So obviously, this second part of my question with the 7 alternatives, 4 being Swedish cities and 3 actually being major cities of Texas, should be harder than when I only had the 3 alternatives, except obviously, no, that's not how it works. So why did I mention 3 alternatives in this case? Because that is the sort of the scientific answer to your question. We have some studies conducted in the 90s that experimented with classroom assessment and how many options is a good amount of options. And the answer is 3. And the reason, I have to drink water again, excuse me. So the reason has to do with the main difficulty of multiple choice item writing, which is constructing the distractors. So it's fairly easy to think of a question you want to ask, and of course the correct answer is fairly easy to formulate. But once you've done that, you have to think of another answer, an incorrect answer that sounds just as plausible as the correct one. And after you finish that, if you want 3 items, 3 options, you have to think of another incorrect answer that's just as plausible as the correct answer and the first distractor that you created. And if you want to create another distractor, yeah, the process begins again. This has to be just as good as the correct one and the first one and the second one. And this tends to be really difficult. So what research has found is that when a teacher in either an elementary school or high school or at the university, when a teacher tries to construct a test with 4 items or more, then only 3 items tend to actually get chosen or selected by students. So it's for almost every item that has 4 or more options, students can fairly easily disregard all but 3 of the options. Now, this means that if you have 4 or more options, and no student actually answers them. It means that as a teacher, I've wasted time constructing that fourth option. And I've sort of wasted the students' time as well, because they still have to spend time reading and then sort of disregarding that option that they obviously didn't want to use anyway. So yeah, 3 is the magic number. Which also begs the question, but if 3 is the magic number, how come large-scale testing uses 4 or 5, such as the SWISAT, högskoleprovet? Why does it use 5 options? Because it is a large-scale test. When the SWISAT is constructed, it takes about 2 years from the item to first become constructed to actually being used in the test. And you have a professional test developer constructing or auditing the items. You have several rounds of a lot of people going through the items. So in this scenario, they're actually able to construct those really difficult tool-less distractors. But in a classroom setting, as a teacher, that is fairly difficult to do. And again, you have the time constraint. So more options is better, but for a classroom test, 3 is generally enough.
You're saying more options are better. Is it to reduce the chance for students to just random guessing?
Yes. More options reduce the chance of getting an item correct while guessing at random, if the options are plausible.
I have a different question. So this is not something that I really know too much about, but in the US, it's more typical with multiple choice questions. Is that correct? It's more used.
Yes, I would venture, I would say, I would agree with that. Yes, in the US, multiple choice questions are used more broadly, yes.
Is there any study that shows, let's say, like the difference in individual output once you're done with school? Is there any, like in GDP or in entrepreneurial, or the difference between multiple choice in school and not having it too much?
Yeah, so I think I understand your question. So can you sort of, if I understand your question correctly, it's about are you more successful later in life, or is there a difference between how successful you are later in life depending on if you went to a school or an educational program with multiple choice questions compared to essay questions? Did I understand that correctly?
Kind of, not really on the individual level, but is there any study that has been shown, like a country produces more, or it has more benefits in, I don't know, societal structures, as they produce more doctors or more lawyers or more teachers, or like in a is there any data study that shows a difference in human output within the country?
Good question. There probably is, but I don't know of, I haven't heard of any or read any.
Is there anything you like intuitively think? Like, let's say back to the other question, is there any that shows that you become a better entrepreneur if you do more multiple choice, or for instance?
Intuitively, I would say no, there would be no difference in later achievement in life, because there are just so many other variables that affect how successful you will become, such as grit being one of the popular ones in later years. It's not just about knowing, it's about having the tenacity to sort of sticking with it, trying to overcome difficulties, motivation, social skills. So I would guess that no, there is no big difference that can be causally related to the item format in education that predicts outcome later in life.
Okay. And another question is interesting that you talked about grit. So I'm wondering, like you've been studying this and you know a lot about it, and seeing the advancement in online learning. And for instance, like, I don't know, there's a lot of online learning that is not verified by any like institution, and there's differences there, I guess. But the effect of being able to take one course multiple times within, because you talk about time as well. So like if I do högskolan in Sweden, I can apply, I don't know, one course once a year, and I'm able to fail or succeed once a year. But with an online course, I'm able to fail or succeed maybe like 7 times a week at the same course. And in that sense, there's another type of aspect of the grid, but also time frame. Like my question is more like, where do you see tests evolving with the possibilities of what internet and online learning gives in this sort of like ability to just take tests repeatedly over and over again, or take a course over and over again within a lot more within a time frame?
That was a really good question and a really hard one.
Yeah.
So I don't have a really good answer to that. I would just like to say that when it comes to the current situation and the future situation of testing, the idea of taking a test repeatedly and by taking that test several times, sort of increasing your knowledge, that's a research area, a field of research called test-based learning or test-enhanced learning. And it has shown, I have some colleagues that they're actually involved in test-based learning, and it has shown some promising results that, you know, taking tests over and over again and is a good way of also actually learning more about the content that is being measured or assessed by these tests. However, I'm not sure if how this actually translates to the question at hand. So yeah, I'm not able to give you a good answer apart from that. I like the idea of test-based learning. Yeah, sorry.
I have a question. How do you know that you ask the right questions and have the right answers, and preferably quickly, so that you don't spend too much time actually constructing the test?
Yeah. So the first thing you do when constructing a test is identifying the construct. That is, what is it I want to measure? What specific activity is it that I want my students to be able to know or do? The second part is that once you know the construct, then you develop a test blueprint or a test plan. So you don't just start with the question, you start with the plan, just as when you're constructing a house. And in this plan, you sort of divide this big construct up into subcategories. Well, I want this content, I want this content, and I want this content. And then when you have all the content you want, you decide how much weight they should have in the test. I want a lot about this first content, I want some about the second, and some about the third. And then when you have all these frames ready, and you decide also based on their weight and what you want them to know, you try to determine the cognitive processes that you want each question to measure, or possibly cognitive levels if you don't know the actual processes. And then when you have this blueprint, well, then you just start, as you do with any other blueprint, you start constructing your questions based on it. Okay, I've written here that I want to have 2 questions on the cognitive process explain, and I think explain is in English. I'm used to talking about them in Swedish. And I want them to measure this and have this many points. Okay, good. And you write those 2 questions. And then you go down 1 step. Okay, I've also decided that I want this particular content in my test. I want 1 question, and I want it to be analyze, organize. Okay, then I'm going to write a question here that has my students organizing something. So that's how you do it. That's how you make sure that your test questions are actually measuring what you want them to, by being clear about what the construct is, by developing a test blueprint, and by developing your questions based on this test blueprint, so you know exactly what each individual question measures.
It sounds really easy, sort of. But thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
I get the impression that you are talking mainly about creating tests for classroom teaching. But how about online learning with e-learning? Would there be any difference, or would your advice be just as valid for creating online learning tests?
Yeah, it's I usually talk about classroom teaching, but yes, it's the identical thing in online learning, because you still have a construct. You have something that you want your test takers to know. Based on this construct, this sort of idea of what you want them to learn, you have some learning outcomes or learning goals. I want them to know this, I want them to know this, I want them to be able to understand, analyze, evaluate all these different things. And then you do basically the same thing. Okay, if I want my students or my test takers to be able to apply this theoretical content in a certain setting, how do I do it? Okay, I construct a multiple choice question that forces them to not only sort of cite from the literature or from the course content on your online learning course, but that actually takes some sort of method and then applies it in a setting of your choosing. So yeah, it's the very same thing, except for you substitute students for test takers, and you substitute expected learning outcome or grading criteria for whatever word it is that you use in online learning. Yeah, it's the same thing.
Thanks.
Just to continue that question, do you see any areas within online learning or e-learning where MCQs are better suited or worse suited for the subject at hand?
Yeah, MCQs are not really effective when you want to measure students' ability to criticize something. If you're talking about the cognitive process, critique or criticize, you can't really have MCQs doing that. And two, MCQs is not ideal when you want your test takers to be able to reason about something. If you want them to sort of produce, if showing your understanding means discussing something or holding a lecture or some form of extended answer, MCQs are obviously halting in that area. So apart from those two, MCQs is really good, and that's why it's also so very widely used, because it's excellent in being able to tap different aspects of a construct, so you can have a lot of questions, so you can get more reliable and valid test results.
Excellent, excellent answer. But one thing I think is so impressive with the Swedish högskoleprovet that you what's it called in English?
SWISAT.
SWISAT, is that you're giving a text and you have to reason about it, and then you have to choose a multiple choice question, answering a very hard question within a large amount of text that you just read. Could you, I don't really have the question is, I see reasoning in that kind of multiple choice question when you have to think about a text and not only just answer easily, if you see what I mean. Do you have a comment on that, since there's no actual question here?
Yes, multiple choice. I think that multiple choice questions sometimes are underappreciated, that you think that because you can use multiple choice questions to measure simple facts, that's all they're good at. But like you just mentioned, reading comprehension and listening comprehension are excellent topics of fairly advanced or complicated situations where it's important to to get information about how much the test taker knows based on what they've read and interpreted, and based on what they've heard and interpreted. And multiple choice questions are excellent for it. And reading comprehension tests have been used with multiple choice questions for almost 100 years now. So it's really well developed and validated, and hard to construct. It's generally harder to construct multiple choice items when the answer is not a factual answer, when it demands an analysis, an interpretation of something, or a summary of something, because it becomes more subjective. I'm glad you raised that question, because yeah, reading comprehension, listening comprehension, excellent for multiple choice questions.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
So my question is about grading. So, like, there's some courses that are binary. You either get pass or fail, and then there's I don't know, GRONLUND. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, and högskoleport, it's 0 to 2. But in the sense of, because högskoleport, you said it takes 2 years for a question to get on to the test. But and it's a lot of multiple choice questions. Like, making the test better, what is it that you should be measuring? Are you measuring results against each other, like students against each other, like the percentage of who is able to answer the question right? Or like my question is, what metrics should you be looking at in order to improve tests to make it better?
Yeah, so you have, first of all, you have the reliability aspect. So the metric you want there generally is the coefficient alpha, sometimes called the Cronbach's alpha. You want to see to what extent the different test items tend to measure the very same thing. Because if you have a certain construct and you want all your items to measure that construct, you can get a metric whether they do that or not. The second thing is the validity aspect. The validity aspect is it's more subjective in nature, but it has some objective aspects as well. So one of the things you want to check with the validity aspect when you have a test battery, that is, you have different subtests, is you want to see how much the different sub scores correlate to each other. And you usually want them to correlate as low as possible. Because if you have a certain construct and you have 5 subtests and you claim that these measure different parts of the construct, if 2 subscores correlate very highly, well, they're not measuring different aspects of the construct, they're measuring the same aspect of the construct, just in 2 different ways. So that's another thing, correlation between subtests. And you want the correlation for the test as a whole to be fairly low. So those are 2 metrics. And then you have some other ones as well. You have something called diff, differential item functioning. You want a low diff score because if you have a low diff, it suggests that all different test taker groups, they perform equally well on the test, so that you are not diff is not always bias, but the presence of diff could mean that there is bias in the test. So with little diff or no diff, that's always a good thing. Oh, and I have so many more. I want to talk for 10 more minutes, but yeah.
I want to stand here and listen for hours more.
But it's fine.
But we need to stop now.
Yeah, because there was a lot to digest. But do you have any, is there any any topic that you could Google later that has all of this inside of it? What do you call this?
So 2 things that you should Google after this. First of all was the article I mentioned. I'm just going to go back. Let's see. The article's name is a review of multiple item writing guidelines for classroom assessment. It's by Downing, Haladina, Downing, and Rodriguez, and it's from 2002. This is an article that everyone should know about and should read, and it has excellent references to other studies and scientific articles. The second one that everyone should know about is the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. This is it's a collection of standards for things that you should think about or reason about in a testing situation. Again, it's called Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. It's excellent for online testing as well. And you can get it because it's now open source, or it exists as a downloadable PDF. So it tells you more about validity, about reliability, about test fairness, item construction, administration, everything. And it's produced by 3 of the largest testing organizations in the US. So you have a lot of great minds behind this, and my throat was killing me. So you have a lot of great researchers and minds behind that text. So take that one as well.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you for listening and for asking really good and sometimes very difficult questions.
So we conclude. Excellent. Thank you very much.